Before we begin today's video, I'd like to give a shout out to one of our newest subscribers, Alpha Beasts. Thank you for subscribing and welcome to the family. And now on with today's video. Greetings, my dear viewers. It is I, Drahon, and welcome back to Pathfinder Hero Frame. We take a look at the ancestries within Pathfinder 2nd Edition and try to figure out the best combination of backgrounds and classes to make your very own characters, solely based off of the lore of these ancestries. And we are finally back with the Halfling. Last time I went over the Panol, the marsupial folk. And to be honest, I mostly did it, so I didn't have to go over the Halfling. I have been putting this off for a good reason. Oh, good for me, not exactly for anyone who is a fan of the Lord of the Rings franchise. 'Cause, Paizo changed absolutely nothing from the Halflings in Dungeons & Dragons. Sure, they changed a couple of things. A couple of cultural things. Like, for example, Halflings have short names, for the most part, because they find long names to be rude. A unnecessary status symbol shows that you're arrogant and way too pompous. There are a couple of Halflings that do have very long names, and that is by design. That character is meant to be arrogant, meant to be rude, figuratively looking down on the rest of the populace. Now, according to the lore of the Halflings, they see reason behind humans and elves having longer names because it's a part of their culture, so they kind of tolerate it. But they kind of share the short name scheme with the Panol, which is why I ended up bringing them up. But, there's not much of a difference. There's still the Hobbit from Lord of the Rings. That's it. There's nothing new here. Sure, in Pathfinder, apparently someone on Paizo's team feels the same way about the Halfling as I do, and decided to give them a bad time in certain cities, as we can see in Giliax and Isgard, where they are treated as slave class. And in Chiliax, they are actually given a derogatory name known as slips, because they're slippery and take your stuff when they're not supposed to be taking stuff. So if you want to play a Kinder in Pathfinder, go for the Halfling, which you could have done that in Dungeons & Dragons too. Don't know why the Kinder was released in Dragonlance. They're the same race. They're both Hobbit-themed, boring races. The same goes with a Halfling. They're just short people with hairy feet. What is the point of the Halfling? We have gnomes. We have dwarves. We don't need any more short humans. I am going to get blasted in the comment section for dissing the Lord of the Rings franchise. It is the stereotypical medieval fantasy. Yes, I get it, but the Halfling in Dungeons & Dragons and in Pathfinder is just boring. Anyway, like I said, someone apparently did not like Halflings, much like myself, because the abuse to the Halfling culture goes a little bit further. In the Mongwai Expanse, they are cannibals. Demon-worshipping cannibals. So if you want to dive a little bit more into that culture, I would recommend my Kolo video, or Knoll, if you prefer. So yeah, a lot of negative feelings for the halfling in Pathfinder, at least in certain settlements. They are still well regarded in most societies. They don't really have cities of their own. Halflings mingle within human society, which can be a little bit of a problem because their diversity in features varies. Sure, you could tell most of the time that a halfling is a full-grown adult. However, a lot of halflings still keep their childlike features, on top of them already being small, so they can easily be mistaken as a human child, even if they are fully grown. You can see where the problem lies. Now, like I said, they tolerate elves having long names too, so they could probably be found in a couple of elf societies. And a lot of the time, the halflings will actually take up human deities when they decide to become religious, and we will get into that once we cover the cleric section. But like I said, not much to talk about. Even within Paizo's lore for the halfling, there isn't much history about the halflings. There's a city that we'll be mentioning here in a moment, but that's about it. There's nothing. They are so unremarkable in Pathfinder 2nd Edition that there is no lore. They're only here so Paizo can give Wizards of the Coast the metaphorical bird. Now, let's go ahead and dive right into character creation for the halfling. I guess if you want more information on the halfling, you could always go over to Dungeons & Dragons character concept and check out the halfling video there to try to get yourself a little bit more info. Anyway, let's get back on topic with the heritages. We have Gutsy Halfling, Hillock Halfling, Jinxed Halfling, Nomadic Halfling, Observant Halfling, Twilight Halfling, and Wild Wood Halfling. For backgrounds, Paizo recommends going with either the Acrobat, Criminal, Emissary, Entertainer, Laborer, or Street Urchin. Now, going over all of the backgrounds in detail, I also found the following to be somewhat accurate. Attention Addict, Blessed, Clown, Cook, Dauntless, Feral Child, Fey Friend, Freed Slave, Gambler, Nomad, Runner, Seer of the Dead, Servant, Spotter, Thrill Seeker, Tree Friend, Time Traveler, Verderon City Folk, Wanderlust, Wildwood Local, and Wonder Taster. Now, there are a couple here that are probably a little bit weird, like, why Fey Friend? Well, that is because kobolds acquaint the halfling to some form of fey folk, which is kind of why they sort of tolerate them, even though halflings kind of deny this connection. I think it's still fun, so it would make sense to have this background, just in case. But the weirdest one here is probably going to be that time traveler background. Why is it even here? Well, that is where we come back to that city that I mentioned. In 4718 AR, the city of Thassilonian of Zin Edasril had been unfrozen from time. Some form of curse was placed on this city that locked it in time. And somehow, at this date, whatever curse was put on it that froze it in time was broken. And there were a bunch of halflings there. So now, these time-displaced halflings are free from their curse. So it stands to reason that if you were to play one of these halflings, you would have the background of the time traveler. That's it. That's the only connection to that background. That's the only interesting piece of lore beyond the naming convention that I could find for the halfling. Let's move on to classes. It is recommended that you take up the cleric, monk, ranger, or rogue. Now that might be the most common of classes, but we're going to go ahead and take a look at each class that has a subclass and see which ones best fit the halfling. Now, if I don't list a class, it doesn't mean that there will not be a halfling that takes that class. It just means I wasn't able to find a good enough connection to the halfling for that class. I'm sure that some of you would actually be able to find plenty of ways to connect a class or even a subclass to the halfling. This is just a small guide based off what lore I could actually find. So let's go ahead and get started with the alchemist, using the research fields of the chirurgeon and the toxicologist. Whenever there's a humanoid race and a toxicologist, you better believe that it's mostly going to reference alcohol. And it seems to be the same thing for the halfling. They like to drink, they like to gamble, and, well, that's pretty much everything that they do besides their normal shenanigans. Apparently, when they are young, they are adventurous and take risks. But then they come to a certain age where they decide, that's not for me anymore. I'll just settle down, start a family, and so on. So, chirurgeon could be a good fit. Maybe they become a traveling doctor. I really don't know. I just thought it was something to use. Moving on to the animus, now we actually get something a little bit better, and that is going to be the apparitions of the custodian of groves and gardens, based off of where you typically can find a halfling. If they are not in the big cities, they're going to be in the hillside, kind of like the Hobbits they are based off of. And then you have the reveler in Lost Glee to go for those young tricksters that like to steal things just because they aren't bolted to the ground. Moving on to the barbarian. There are not many instances where I can see a halfling barbarian, but some of the more popular streams that make games for halflings will have a halfling barbarian, which is funny. So, instincts for a halfling barbarian. I can see the animal and the blood rager for those Mongwai Expanse halflings. The Wildwood halfling would probably take up the Ligneous instinct, with the Twilight taking up the Spirit instincts. And Jinxed, probably going for that superstition barbarian instinct. Just based off of what I can find within the subtext of these different heritages. And I put the giant instinct barbarian mostly for the joke of the tiny guy becoming a giant and being able to wield a weapon that he probably shouldn't be able to wield in the first place. Alright, moving on to Bard. This one actually seems to be the more common one, so I was actually surprised when I couldn't find a subclass for a Halfling Bard. But the best ones that I could technically find were the muses of the Polymath and Zoophonia. In Dungeons & Dragons, the Halfling had a favored animal companion. I can't remember exactly what it was. It may have been a weasel, but I don't quite remember. But I think they farmed weasels or something like that. They were kind of one of those breeds of breeding services. Something like the hunting dogs that us humans like to breed. Moving on to the champion. Once again, going off of the fact that the younger halflings seem to be more rambunctious and will do whatever they please just to get some form of dopamine. The cause of desecration and grandeur made the most sense, but I picked liberation as well. Mostly for the fact that, like I mentioned, some cities only find halflings useful as slave labor. So, having a halfling that is going around freeing his fellow halflings, liberating them of their chains, would actually make perfect sense. There's another reason why, and that is because of one of the deities that the halflings tend to serve when they aren't serving their own deities. So let's go ahead and talk about the cleric next. Like I said, there are plenty of deities from the human pantheon that the halflings will serve. Abadar, Caden Kalian, the accidental god, which they serve because they like his ideals of liberation, which is why I chose Liberation Paladin or Champion, because of this occasional worship of Caden Kalian. Moving on to Desna, Erastil, Iomade, Norgorber. Sometimes they will call him the Grey Master, and some of the more nefarious of halflings are said to call him Blackfingers. But either case, they still worship Norgorber. Norgorber. Next is Sarenye, which is actually the first time we mentioned this deity in a video, which is hilarious and kind of concerning. It's based off of what I know of Sarenye. Next we have Shellen. And then finally we have our two actual halfling deities, Chaldira and Thamir. Moving on to the Druid class. The Druidic orders that I think best work for a halfling would be the Animal, Cultivation, Leaf, and the Untamed. Moving on to the Gunslinger. I can see the Drifter being the most common, but I also see Pistolaro and Triggerbrand being very useful for a halfling to pick up. Especially if you're going for an entertainer, that Pistolaro is definitely going to be rather entertaining. Next is the Investigator. I don't see too many halflings going for Investigator, but if you do decide to go for an Investigator halfling, the interrogation methodology is probably a best bet next to Esoterica, or the Palatine Detective. Moving on to the Magus. The hybrid studies of the Laughing Shadow, Twisting Tree, and Unfurling Brocade are the ones that I felt closely resembled a Halfling subclass. Next is the Rogue. For roguish rackets, I recommend the Eldritch Trickster, the Ruffian, the Scoundrel, and the Thief. For those younger, more rambunctious, criminal halflings. Next is the Sorcerer. Not too many bloodlines that I would recommend. Sure, you can go for the Imperium halfling, since technically just about anyone could be descended from a great spellcaster, especially a halfling. But for bloodlines, I thought that the demon-worshipping cannibals from the Mongwai Expanse could become demonic bloodline sorcerers. Kind of a higher-ranking cannibal, if you will. And once again, referencing how kobolds see halflings, I decided to go with the Fey bloodline. It's probably not accurate, but considering how little lore we've got, I decided to go for it. Think of it as a creative liberty. Next is the Swashbuckler. The only two styles that I thought would work for the halfling would be the Braggart and the Rascal, seeing as they are so rambunctious and like to steal things that aren't bolted down and just annoy everyone that they come in contact with. Moving on to the Witch. Again, not too many themes that I can see going for a halfling witch, but I decided to go with the Paradox of Opposites and the Wilding Steward. Kind of a stereotype for these videos, I guess. If I'm going to give them the witch, it's most likely going to be a Wilding Steward. And finally, for our wizard, the arcane schools that I think would best fit halfling are the Ars Grammatica and the Mentalism schools. And there we have it. A slightly detailed list of options for any halfling character that you wish to make. What type of halfling would you play as? Let me know in the comment section down below. And also let me know if there was some lore that I missed that I somehow could not find in the 2 full pages of lore that I was able to find on this ancestry. From the Pathfinder wiki to Archives of Nethys. Yeah, somehow there wasn't enough information for me to go off of based off of those 2 sites. But anyway, I do hope to see you next time when I am online.